He was a man the world admired and feared. Ethan Mercer, the billionaire who built an empire out of steel, glass, and silence. For decades, he lived untouched by anyone, wrapped in rules and distance, haunted by a single tragedy that froze his heart long ago. To everyone else, he was untouchable, unreachable, a man who had everything except peace. And then she walked in, Clara Whitmore young, determined, unpolished, but carrying a light the world hadn't shown him in years. She didn't come to change him, only to do her job. But sometimes, destiny doesn't knock. It quietly takes a seat across the desk and waits to be noticed. This is not just a story about power and love. It's about the walls we build to survive, and the one soul brave enough to walk through them. Stay with this story, because what begins as duty will unfold into something far deeper. A journey of redemption, courage, and the simple touch that can thaw even the coldest heart. Because sometimes, even the strongest man is just waiting for someone kind enough to reach through the glass. The glass tower rose against the Chicago skyline like a shard of light, catching every flicker of sunrise that dared to touch it. Mercer Tower, 40 floors of mirrored ambition, where power spoke in quiet tones and every reflection seemed to whisper success. And standing before it, clutching the strap of her worn leather bag, was Clara Whitmore. The October air bit gently at her cheeks, carrying the scent of coffee from the cafe across the street and the distant hum of traffic. She tilted her head back, trying to see the top of the building. It looked endless, as if the morning itself began somewhere up there. For a moment, she wondered what kind of people worked behind those spotless windows, people who never had to count change before paying rent, who didn't feel their hearts race each time the mail brought another bill. Her fingers trembled slightly as she adjusted the collar of her thrift store coat. Today was her first day as a secretary at Mercer Industries, a job she'd prayed for, fought for, and promised herself she wouldn't lose. It wasn't just a paycheck, it was a doorway, a chance to step into a life where she didn't have to worry about whether the heat would stay on through winter. Inside, the lobby greeted her with marble floors so polished they mirrored her shoes. Everything glowed in soft gold and silver hues. The air smelled faintly of lilies, the kind only found in arrangements that cost more than her week's groceries. She paused for a breath, the sound of her heels echoing too loudly, reminding her she didn't quite belong yet. The receptionist looked up with a polite smile. "You must be Clara. Ms. Hall is expecting you on the 39th floor." Clara nodded, murmured a thank you, and stepped into the elevator. The doors closed, and silence wrapped around her like a fragile cocoon. As the floor numbers climbed 10, 18, 26, she felt the weight of her past sink lower, replaced by something lighter. Hope, maybe, or fear dressed up as courage. When the doors opened, she was met with a view that almost stole her breath. The upper floors of Mercer Tower were glass-walled, flooded with light. Chicago stretched below her, a quilt of motion and memory. She could see Lake Michigan shimmering in the distance, blue-gray and endless. Clara Whitmore. The voice came from a woman standing by the reception desk, a woman in her 60s, with kind eyes framed by silver hair neatly pinned back. Maggie Hall. Her presence was calm, but carried an unmistakable authority, the sort earned from decades of knowing exactly how things should run. "Yes, ma'am," Clara replied softly. Maggie smiled, a faint, approving curve. "Come with me. Mr. Mercer values punctuality." They walked together down a corridor lined with glass offices. Clara noticed how quiet it was, no idle chatter, no laughter, just the rhythmic tap of keyboards and the soft hum of air conditioning. Everything was immaculate, almost too perfect, as if disorder itself had been banished from these halls. "This is where you'll work," Maggie said, stopping beside a large corner office. Through the glass, Clara caught a glimpse of a sleek desk, leather chairs, and a wall of windows that made the city seem close enough to touch. Her heart beat faster. Somewhere beyond that glass wall was him, Ethan Mercer, the man she would be assisting, a name that carried weight in every financial circle, a man known for building an empire from nothing and for keeping his distance from everyone. Maggie turned to her, studying Clara's nervous hands. "You've done office work before. Yes, at a law firm downtown. Smaller, of course." "Good," Maggie said. "Mr. Mercer appreciates efficiency. He notices everything: the tone of an email, the timing of a meeting, the way someone carries themselves. Just stay calm. Do your work well." Clara nodded, her throat suddenly dry. Maggie hesitated, then added in a quieter voice, "There's one thing you should know." Clara looked up, waiting. "Mr. Mercer doesn't like to be touched." The words hung in the air, simple yet heavy. For a moment, Clara thought she'd misheard. "You mean no handshakes, no casual gestures," Maggie said, her tone gentle but firm. "It's not personal. It's just his way." Clara nodded again, unsure how to respond. She wasn't one to invade anyone's space, but the warning carried a strange weight, as if behind it lived a story too painful to tell. They continued the tour: printing room, conference area, break lounge, but Clara's thoughts drifted back to that final sentence. He doesn't like to be touched. She wondered what could make a person build such invisible walls. Trauma loss. Or perhaps the kind of loneliness that hardens over time until it feels safer than hope. When Maggie left her to settle at her desk, Clara sat down slowly, smoothing her skirt and arranging her pens as if each movement might steady her pulse. Outside the glass, the city glimmered, full of lives she'd never know. Somewhere within these mirrored walls, a man carried a silence deep enough that people learned to orbit around it. And there she was, just a new hire from Ohio, with trembling hands and a stubborn belief that maybe, just maybe, kindness could find its way through even the thickest glass. She took a quiet breath and looked toward the closed door at the end of the corridor. Her first morning had begun, and though she didn't know it yet, that single step into Mercer Tower would change everything, because sometimes the smallest beginnings carry the softest kind of miracle. That first morning ended quietly, with Clara arranging papers and glancing every so often toward the glass door at the far end of the corridor. She hadn't yet met him, the man whose name hovered over every document, every whispered conversation: Ethan Mercer. To most people, he was a figure seen only in business magazines or on television screens, a man whose fortune seemed untouchable. But here, in this tower of glass and light, he was real, and in a few minutes, she would meet him. Maggie appeared at her desk just before 10, holding a slim leather folder. "He's ready for you," she said softly, as if entering a sacred space required reverence. Clara rose, smoothing her skirt. Her pulse thrummed in her ears. She followed Maggie through the long corridor, each step muffled by the thick carpet. At the end stood a glass door with the words, "Ethan Mercer, CEO," etched in silver. When Maggie opened it, the room unfolded like a photograph come to life. Broad windows overlooking the city, shelves lined with architecture models, a desk of dark oak gleaming under soft light. And behind it, he stood. Ethan Mercer turned as they entered, the morning sun catching the sharp line of his jaw. His suit was charcoal gray, tailored so precisely it looked like it had been sewn from shadow. His hair, touched with silver at the temples, framed a face that might have been carved from quiet resolve. But it was his eyes that struck her most: steel blue, cool and still, like winter before the storm. "Mr. Mercer," Maggie said gently, "this is Clara Whitmore, your new secretary." He gave a curt nod, his expression unreadable. "Miss Whitmore." Clara managed a polite smile. "It's an honor, sir." He didn't extend a hand. His remained resting lightly on the edge of the desk, as if the air itself were a boundary he preferred not to cross. She remembered Maggie's words. He doesn't like to be touched. The rule was real, and it existed between them like a sheet of invisible glass. "Have a seat," he said. His voice was low, even, with the kind of calm that could silence a room. She sat opposite him, her back straight, fingers clasped lightly in her lap. He opened the folder Maggie had handed him. "You'll manage my correspondence by schedule and meeting briefs. Discretion is essential. You'll find we value privacy here." "Yes, sir." His gaze flickered up, meeting hers just long enough for her to feel the distance between them, polite, precise, almost clinical. It wasn't unkind, but it carried the weight of someone who had long ago built walls to keep the world from trespassing. He spoke again, explaining the protocols: no unexpected visitors, no direct calls, no unnecessary small talk. He dictated in short, measured phrases, his tone clipped, his eyes never wandering. Clara took notes as quickly as she could, careful not to interrupt. But behind the steady rhythm of his words, she sensed something else. A weariness, perhaps, a kind of restrained sorrow that lingered in the way he paused before certain sentences, the way his gaze shifted when the sunlight caught the window. When the meeting ended, he gave a final nod. "Maggie will show you the rest. Welcome to Mercer Industries." It should have felt like a formality, but to Clara, it was strangely heavy, as if this welcome came from a man who hadn't truly welcomed anyone in years. As she stood, her chair made a soft sound against the floor. His eyes flicked toward her again, alert, cautious, almost startled. She offered a gentle smile, an instinctive gesture of warmth. He didn't return it, but something in his posture eased, just slightly, before he looked away. Outside the office, Maggie closed the door quietly behind them. "You did well," she said. Clara exhaled, realizing she'd been holding her breath. "He's different." Maggie gave a knowing smile. "You'll get used to it. Just remember, Mr. Mercer doesn't mean to be distant. He's learned to live that way." The rest of the day passed in a blur of emails, schedules, and hushed instructions. Every now and then, Clara caught glimpses of him through the glass wall standing at the window, hands in his pockets, staring out at the city as if searching for something he'd lost long ago. There was a gravity about him, a silence that seemed to absorb sound. The employees who passed his office spoke in whispers, careful not to disturb that quiet. It wasn't fear, exactly. It was respect touched with mystery. During lunch, Clara sat by the large window in the break room, watching the clouds drift above the lake. She thought of Ethan Mercer again, of his eyes like frozen water, and the way his words seemed to come from somewhere deep and guarded. People said money changed a person, but Clara didn't believe that was what she saw. No, what she saw was a man carrying something too heavy to set down, a man whose success had become both armor and isolation. That evening, as the office emptied, Clara lingered a moment longer, gathering her notes. Through the glass, she saw Ethan still at his desk, the city lights painting faint patterns on the walls around him. He didn't move, didn't look up. He just sat there, the glow of the computer reflecting in his eyes, as if he couldn't bring himself to leave. In that moment, Clara understood something: loneliness could wear 1,000 faces. It could live inside a penthouse or a crowded street, and no amount of wealth could silence it. She turned off her desk lamp, the soft click echoing in the quiet, and as she walked toward the elevator, she promised herself something small but certain: she would do her work well. Yes, but she would also see him, truly see him, in ways that perhaps no one else dared to. Because sometimes, what people need most isn't admiration or pity. It's the simple grace of being seen. And though she didn't yet know what their paths would hold, Clara felt deep down that this meeting, brief and fragile as it was, had already begun to shift something inside both of them. The man behind the glass remained where he was, untouched and untouchable. But somewhere in that stillness, a quiet crack began to form, so small it could barely be seen, yet enough to let the first light in. The days that followed settled into a quiet rhythm. Clara learned the language of Mercer Tower, the subtle glances, the precise timing, the way conversations floated just above a whisper whenever Ethan Mercer's door was closed. Each morning, she prepared his schedule, printed reports, and placed his coffee 150 degrees, exactly on the tray outside his office. He never asked for more, never less. Everything about him seemed measured, deliberate, untouched by chance. She admired that discipline, even as she wondered what it must feel like to live within so many rules that kept him safe, but also alone. It was late one evening when the story began to unfold. Most of the staff had gone home. The city lights shimmered against the glass walls, and the soft hum of the building filled the silence. Clara stayed behind to finish a report, her lamp casting a small circle of gold on the desk. Maggie appeared in the doorway, her coat draped over one arm, her expression thoughtful. "You should head home, dear," Maggie said gently. "It's getting late." Clara smiled. "I just have one more page to finish." "I don't mind." Maggie stepped closer, lowering her voice. "You've done well these past weeks. Mr. Mercer's noticed." Clara looked up, a bit surprised. "He has—" "Oh, he won't say it outright," Maggie said, a small chuckle escaping her. "But he notices everything. The man could tell if a comma is out of place." Her laughter faded softly, replaced by a weight Clara couldn't name. There was a pause, one of those pauses that seemed to open a door to something deeper. "You've probably heard the stories," Maggie continued. "People talk. They speculate. But I think you should hear it from someone who was here." Clara closed her notebook, giving the older woman her full attention. "It was 2008, Maggie began. The Mercer Bridge project, a major undertaking, his design, his pride. Everyone said it would redefine the skyline, connect the city in a way no other bridge had before. And then, one morning in May, it collapsed. A structural failure during a test run." Her voice softened, heavy with memory. "Dozens were injured. 3 people died. One of them was his fiancée." Clara felt her breath catch. His fiancée, Maggie nodded. Her name was Lillian Hart. She was there to surprise him, to see the bridge before the opening ceremony. No one was supposed to be on the site, but she wanted to celebrate his success. When the cables gave way, she paused, eyes glistening. He was there. He saw it happen. The room was silent except for the faint ticking of the clock. Clara's mind filled with the image, steel twisting, water churning below, the sound of breaking metal, and a man watching helplessly as everything he loved fell in front of him. She understood now why Ethan's eyes held that distant coldness, why his voice carried a trace of restraint even in the simplest words. Maggie sighed. They said it wasn't his fault. The investigation found an error in the manufacturing, something no one could have predicted. But Ethan never forgave himself. He shut the world out. No handshakes, no touch, not even a pat on the shoulder. He rebuilt the company, but he never rebuilt himself. Clara sat very still, her fingers pressed together. She felt no pity. Pity seemed too small, too shallow for what she imagined he carried. What she felt instead was a deep ache of understanding, a quiet empathy that reached somewhere beyond words. Maggie continued, her voice tender now. "I stayed because someone needed to. He doesn't trust easily, but he's not cruel, just afraid, I think, afraid of what might happen if he lets anyone close again." Clara looked toward Ethan's office door. The light was still on, a faint glow spilling into the hallway. "He's still working," she murmured. Maggie followed her gaze and smiled sadly. "He works when he can't sleep. He's been doing that for 17 years. When Maggie finally left, the office grew quiet again. Clara gathered her things but couldn't bring herself to leave just yet. She walked to the window, staring at the dark outline of the river below. In the distance, the faint shimmer of the new Mercer Bridge crossed the water, a monument of steel and redemption. She wondered if he ever looked at it, or if the sight only reminded him of what he'd lost. In that moment, she thought about how pain can turn into ritual, how people build invisible rules to protect themselves, calling it strength when, in truth, it's survival. Ethan's rule of ice wasn't cruelty. It was grief wearing discipline's disguise. The next morning, when Clara arrived early to prepare his office, she moved quietly, careful not to disturb him. But as she placed the folder on his desk, she hesitated. On top of it, she set a small note written in her neat, steady hand. "You can't fix the past, Mr. Mercer, but you can let it breathe." She left before he came in, unsure if he'd ever read it or if he'd see it as an intrusion. Yet she hoped that maybe, in some quiet corner of his mind, those words might linger. That day, Ethan was his usual self, measured, efficient, distant. But when Clara walked into his office to deliver the morning reports, she noticed something subtle. The note was gone, and though his face remained unreadable, there was a softness in his eyes, like a winter thaw just beginning. For Clara, that was enough. She didn't need thanks or acknowledgement. What mattered was the faint shift in the air, the sense that beneath the rule of ice, something human still stirred. And as she returned to her desk, she realized that some people build walls not to keep others out, but to see who might care enough to reach through. After that night, Clara began to look at Ethan Mercer differently, not as the untouchable figure behind the glass, but as a man carrying a history carved deep beneath the surface. Maggie's words lingered in her mind like an echo. He doesn't trust easily, but he's not cruel. Each morning, Clara arrived early. Clara. She moved quietly through the still corridors, her heels barely making a sound against the marble floors. There was something sacred about those early hours, the city just waking, sunlight slowly spreading across the glass walls of Mercer Tower. It was in these moments, before the world rushed in, that she felt closest to understanding him. Ethan had routines, the kind that spoke of a man clinging to control. Every detail mattered: the temperature of the room, the alignment of files, and above all, his coffee 150 degrees Fahrenheit, not a degree more or less. Maggie had warned her early on. He'll know, she'd said. He always knows. Clara didn't mind. There was comfort in precision, and in a way, she admired his discipline. It was as if each rule kept his world from collapsing again. That morning, she stood by the counter in the executive lounge, watching the digital thermometer dip and rise until it hit exactly the right number. The smell of roasted beans filled the air, rich and steady. She poured the dark liquid into his favorite porcelain cup, a minimalist design, white with a thin silver rim. She carried it carefully, like something fragile and sacred, through the quiet corridor to his office. Inside, Ethan was at his desk, sleeves rolled up, the morning light tracing the edges of his face. His attention was fixed on a blueprint spread wide across the desk lines and curves that spoke of ambition and perfection. "Good morning, Mr. Mercer," Clara said softly. He didn't look up right away, just murmured, "Morning," his pen moving in precise strokes. She stepped forward, placing the cup gently near the corner of his desk. "Your coffee. 150 degrees. That made him glance up, almost as if surprised she remembered. "Thank you," he said, his voice quiet. Even, she smiled faintly and began to pull back her hand. But at that same moment, he reached for the cup, his fingers brushing against hers. Just barely. It happened so fast, and yet time seemed to slow. His reaction was immediate, almost instinctive. He flinched sharp, visible as if the warmth of her skin had burned through the barrier he'd spent years perfecting. The cup slipped from his hand, shattering the stillness. Coffee splashed across the desk, dark stains spreading over a pile of documents. Clara gasped, reaching instinctively for a napkin. "I'm so sorry. I didn't mean..." But Ethan had already stepped back, his breath uneven. His right hand trembled, not from pain, but from something deeper. Memory. Panic. Maybe both. His eyes weren't on the mess, but on his own hand, as if seeing a ghost only he could recognize. "Mr. Mercer." Clara's voice was soft, careful, the way one might speak to a frightened child. She took a small step forward, but stopped herself. She remembered his rule. He closed his eyes for a moment, steadying himself, forcing air back into his lungs. "It's fine," he said finally, though his voice was strained. "Just leave it I'll take care of it. She shook her head gently. Please, let me clean it. It's my mistake. Without waiting for permission, Clara reached for the papers, dabbing at the edges where the liquid had seeped in. Her movements were calm, deliberate. She didn't rush. She didn't look away from him, either. Ethan stood still, watching her, his hand now pressed against his side, his eyes flickering between her face and the stained papers. He seemed lost between two instincts to retreat and to stay. When the worst of the spill was gone, Clara straightened slowly. There, she said softly. Good as new. He stared at her for a long moment, and she noticed something shift in his expression, not anger, not even embarrassment, something more fragile. Confusion. Maybe, or disbelief that someone could stand that close to his chaos without flinching. I'm sorry, she repeated. I should have been more careful. He shook his head slightly. It wasn't your fault. The words were quiet, almost reluctant, but genuine. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The city outside buzzed faintly beyond the glass, distant and indifferent. Inside, time seemed suspended. Clara could feel the tension still humming in the air, the invisible line between them drawn and redrawn in silence. Then, gently, she said, It's just coffee, Mr. Mercer. Nothing that can't be cleaned. His eyes lifted to hers, and for the first time, she thought she saw a flicker of warmth like a crack in winter ice when the first sunlight touches it. He exhaled, a slow, careful breath. You can call me Ethan, he said, almost as an afterthought. Clara blinked, surprised by the sudden intimacy of it. All right, as Ethan. He nodded once, turning back to his desk, his hands steady again. But as she left the room, she felt the smallest sense of something new taking root, an understanding that wasn't spoken aloud, only felt, that evening, when she packed her things. She noticed the broken coffee cup had been replaced with a new one, identical, except for one detail. This one had no silver rim, no fragile edge that could catch or crack. It was simple, sturdy, and quietly elegant, much like the man himself, though he would never admit it. And as Clara rode the elevator down, watching the city fade beneath her, she realized something beautiful sometimes. Healing doesn't begin with a grand gesture. It begins in moments of accident, when two worlds collide not perfectly, but honestly. Perhaps it wasn't the coffee that mattered at all. Perhaps it was that, for the first time in years, Ethan Mercer had been touched by another human being, and the world hadn't ended. In the days that followed the coffee spill, something subtle shifted in the quiet rhythm of the office. Ethan Mercer still kept his distance, still spoke in that measured tone of his. But there was an almost imperceptible softness now, like the air had changed temperature around him. Clara noticed it in the smallest gestures, the way he paused before giving instructions, or the faint nod of acknowledgement when she entered the room. He hadn't mentioned the incident, and neither did she. But sometimes, silence can hold more meaning than words ever could. It was as if that single, accidental touch had awakened a forgotten corner of his heart, a place that remembered what it felt like to be human. Clara worked diligently, filling her days with purpose. She arrived before sunrise, her breath fogging in the crisp Chicago air, and often stayed until the city lights blurred into gold against the glass walls. From her desk outside his office, she observed Ethan through the transparent divide. It wasn't voyeurism. It was curiosity tinged with quiet empathy. He was a man of habits. Every morning, precisely at 8, he put on a pair of thin black gloves, custom leather, unwrinkled, immaculate. He wore them not out of vanity, but protection. They were his armor. She saw how he adjusted them before every meeting, how his fingers flexed once beneath the smooth material, like someone rehearsing composure. He rarely left the building before midnight. Often. Clara would pass by his office late in the evening to find him standing before the vast windows, his reflection merging with the city skyline. Papers were spread across the desk, his laptop glowing faintly, and yet his eyes were far away, fixed not on the numbers, but on something beyond them. She learned the rhythm of his solitude, the way he sipped his coffee at exact intervals, the faint crease between his brows when a thought refused to settle, the rare but quiet sigh when he believed no one was listening. It wasn't pity that filled her heart, it was something gentler, something closer to recognition. She too had known loneliness, though hers had taken a different shape, the loneliness of scraping by, of dreams postponed for rent checks and overdue bills. But pain, she understood, was an equalizer. It humbled both the rich and the poor in its quiet, persistent ache. One evening, long after most of the staff had gone home, Clara found herself still at her desk, sorting through a pile of documents Ethan needed for the morning. Through the glass, she saw him seated at his desk, the glow of the desk lamp outlining his profile. He looked exhausted, shoulders tense, the weight of years pressing invisibly against his back. She hesitated, then took a small square of paper from her notebook. In her neat handwriting, she wrote just 3 words. "You're doing fine," no signature, no explanation. Just that. She slipped it onto his desk when he stepped out for a call, placing it near the stack of papers he would review before leaving. It wasn't meant as encouragement, exactly more like a small reminder that even in his world of glass and steel, someone saw him. When she returned the next morning, the note was gone. For a moment, she wondered if he had thrown it away without reading it. But then she noticed something curious. The paperweight on his desk, the heavy silver one shaped like a bridge, had been moved slightly to the left, right where the note had been. That tiny shift felt like an answer. From then on, their silence carried a different texture. When she entered the room, he no longer looked past her. His gaze met hers for a heartbeat longer. When she handed him a document, he sometimes murmured a quiet "thank you," words that once seemed foreign to his lips. Yet he remained distant in all the ways that mattered. The gloves stayed on, the walls remained high. But Clara understood now they weren't walls of pride, but of fear. Fear that one touch, one act of closeness, might break him open in ways he wasn't ready to face. Still, cracks had begun to form. She could feel it. The human heart, after all, doesn't shatter all at once, it thaws. Slowly, cautiously. Maggie noticed it too. One afternoon, as they shared coffee in the break room, the older woman smiled knowingly. "You've done something to him," she said. Clara shook her head. "I've done nothing." Maggie chuckled softly. "Exactly. You let him be. Sometimes that's all a wounded soul needs to be seen without being fixed." That night, as Clara left the office, she glanced one last time at Ethan's silhouette framed against the skyline. He stood motionless, hands in his pockets, staring at the city below. It struck her how he looked like a man both inside and outside the world, at once present but unreachable. She didn't know what tomorrow would bring, or whether those walls would ever come down completely, but she sensed something shifting, a faint warmth finding its way through the cracks, like sunlight sneaking past the edges of drawn curtains. As she stepped into the elevator, Clara carried that quiet hope with her. Not the loud, triumphant kind, but the gentle sort that whispers rather than shouts, the kind that tells you that, even in the coldest hearts, light can still find a way in, and somewhere behind those glass walls. Ethan Mercer sat alone at his desk, staring at an empty spot where a small piece of paper used to be. His gloved hand rested near it, unmoving, thoughtful. He didn't know why 3 simple words had stayed with him so long, or why, for the first time in years, the silence around him no longer felt quite so empty. But he kept that paper, folded neatly in the top drawer of his desk. And though no one would ever see it, he knew it was there, proof that even the most fragile kindness could leave a mark strong enough to be felt through glass, through distance, even through the coldest of rules. The winter sun had begun to set earlier each evening, turning the glass walls of Mercer Tower into vast mirrors of gold. It was during one of those fading afternoons that Clara noticed something different about Ethan. He seemed quieter than usual, not the cold, distant kind of quiet she had grown used to, but the kind that came from someone lost in memory. He had been staring out the window for a long time that day. his reflection merging with the skyline, as though the city itself were whispering back old secrets. Clara didn't ask. She had learned that with people like Ethan Mercer. Silence was not avoidance, it was armor. But some truths have a way of reaching out on their own, even when no one is looking for them. It happened on a Thursday evening. Most of the staff had gone home, and the office was wrapped in that soft stillness that comes when only a few lights remain. Clara was sorting through a cabinet near Ethan's desk, searching for a proposal draft she needed to finalize. The folders were labeled neatly contracts, projects, legal, then tucked between two newer binders. She saw one worn with age, its label faded but still legible in faint black ink. Bridge Project 2008. She froze, the air around her suddenly heavy. Maggie's voice echoed faintly in her memory. The bridge collapse, the tragedy, the fiancé who never came home. For a moment, Clara considered leaving it untouched, but curiosity, or perhaps compassion, guided her hand. She lifted the folder gently and placed it on the desk. The cover creaked slightly when she opened it, as if it hadn't been disturbed in years. Inside were architectural sketches, lines, and angles drawn by a steady, ambitious hand. Ethan's handwriting filled the margins, precise, detailed, confident. Then came the photos, construction in progress, proud workers, beams stretching across a river that gleamed under summer light. It was a beautiful design, strong, elegant, but beneath one of the blueprints was a newspaper clipping, its edges yellowed with time. The headline stopped her breath. Mercer Bridge collapse claims. 3 lives, CEO among the injured. The photograph beneath the words captured a scene of chaos, twisted steel, smoke rising, rescue crews in reflective vests. And near the bottom, a man, Ethan Mercer, younger then, his face pale beneath dust and blood, his expression one of disbelief frozen in time. Clara's eyes lingered there, tracing the haunted look in his eyes. It wasn't just grief. It was guilt so deep it had rewritten the shape of his soul. As she turned the next page, another image slipped out, a candid photo, smaller, folded once down the middle. A woman with chestnut hair and a bright, unguarded smile stood beside Ethan, her hand resting lightly on his arm. Lillian Hart, the fiancée Maggie had spoken of. In the photo, Ethan looked younger, softer, his arm resting protectively around her waist. There was light in his eyes, than the kind that only love can create. Clara placed the photo back into the folder, her chest tightening. It wasn't sorrow she felt, it was something gentler, deeper. The ache of seeing how much one heart could lose and still find the strength to keep beating. The office door creaked softly, and Clara startled, nearly dropping the file. But it wasn't Ethan. Only the wind outside had shifted, rattling faintly against the glass. She took a long breath, steadying herself, and carefully began returning everything to its place. She didn't read further. Some stories, she knew, didn't need to be unfolded all at once. Still. As she closed the folder, her fingers brushed across the title again, Bridge Project 2008. She wondered how many times he had opened it himself, torturing his mind with the what-ifs that follow tragedy like a shadow. When Ethan came in the next morning, his movements carried that same quiet restraint she'd seen the day before. His gloves were on, his voice calm. But Clara saw it now, the subtle fatigue in his posture, the way his gaze avoided the sunlight spilling through the windows. Grief, she thought, doesn't disappear, it simply learns how to hide in plain sight. Later that day, while he reviewed a report, Clara spoke softly. "Mr. Mercer, may I ask you something?" He looked up, cautious but attentive. "Yes. How do you know when something you've built is strong enough?" He seemed taken aback by the question. For a moment, he didn't answer. Then, in a tone quiet but certain, he said, "When it doesn't collapse under the weight of its own design." She nodded slowly, absorbing the deeper meaning behind his words. Maybe he wasn't just talking about architecture. Maybe he was talking about himself. That night, after Ethan left. Clara stood by the window again. The city shimmered below and across the river. The new Mercer Bridge stretched gracefully against the night sky. Its reflection rippled on the water, steady, unbroken. She thought about how he must have rebuilt it, piece by piece, not just as an engineer, but as a man searching for redemption. Maybe that bridge wasn't just steel and concrete. Maybe it was his way of saying sorry to her, to himself, to the past. Clara turned off the lights before leaving, but as she passed his office, she paused, hand on the doorframe. On the desk, beside his lamp, she noticed a small framed photograph she hadn't seen before. It was of the finished bridge, sunlight glinting off its structure. Beneath it, engraved in small letters, were 3 words, "Never again fall." She smiled faintly, a whisper of admiration rising in her chest. It wasn't the kind of smile that dismissed pain, it was the kind that honored it, recognizing the courage it takes to live with what can't be undone. As she stepped into the quiet elevator, she thought of Ethan Mercer, not the billionaire behind the glass, but the young man who once stood at the edge of ruin and still chose to build again. And in that thought, Clara found a kind of grace, because sometimes the greatest strength isn't in what we build, but in what we dare to rebuild after everything has fallen. That night, the rain came without warning. It began as a whisper against the tall windows of Mercer Tower, then grew into a steady drumming, soft, rhythmic, relentless. The city below shimmered under the wet glow of streetlights, while thunder rolled distantly over Lake Michigan. Clara stayed late, as she often did. The office was quiet, emptied of voices and footsteps, the only sound the storm and the faint hum of the heating system. She had stayed behind to finish a report, but her eyes drifted toward the bookshelf in Ethan's office, the one where she'd first found the old folder labeled Bridge Project 2008. It was still there, tucked neatly between 2 newer binders. As she hadn't touched it since that day. But something about the rain made her heart ache with a kind of restless empathy. The folder, once just paper and ink, had come to symbolize everything Ethan carried the weight he never spoke of, the pain that seemed to haunt even his quietest moments. She rose from her desk and stepped closer to the glass door of his office. The lights were dim, casting the room in muted shades of amber and gray. She hesitated, then reached for the folder and gently opened it once more. Her fingers brushed over the photo of the bridge whole and shining before it fell. She imagined the moment it collapsed, the sound of steel screaming, the helplessness of a man watching his life crumble in an instant. And she imagined the silence afterward, the kind that doesn't end when the noise does. "You shouldn't look at that." The voice came from behind her, low, steady, and close enough to make her heart stop. She turned sharply. Ethan stood in the doorway, rainwater still glistening on the shoulders of his dark coat. His hair was damp, his eyes shadowed, and for a moment he looked less like the composed CEO and more like a man caught between the past and the present. "I'm sorry," Clara whispered, closing the folder gently. "I didn't mean to intrude." He stepped farther into the room, his gaze falling on the open file. But instead of anger, there was only exhaustion, an old, familiar kind that seemed to sit deep in his bones. "It's all right," he said quietly. "People always wonder about it eventually." Clara wanted to speak, to explain that she hadn't been searching for gossip or answers, but something in his voice stopped her. He didn't sound like a man accusing her of crossing a line. He sounded like someone who had finally grown too tired to guard his walls. He walked to the window, watching the rain run down the glass in thin, unbroken lines. "It was supposed to be my masterpiece," he said. "I designed every beam, every joint. It passed every inspection, and yet, the day before the opening, it fell." Clara stayed silent. She sensed he wasn't looking for questions or comfort, just the space to finally speak. "She was there," he continued, voice quieter now. "Lillian. She wanted to surprise me. I told her not to come to the site, but she said she wanted to see what I'd built, to see what our future looked like." He gave a short, bitter laugh. "Our future lasted 6 minutes." He turned then, his face pale under the amber light. The official report blamed a flaw in the manufacturing, but I know what I did. I rushed the timeline. I ignored a warning from the safety team. I told myself it would hold. His hands clenched at his sides, the leather of his gloves creaking softly. When they pulled me out from the rubble, I thought she was behind me, but she wasn't. She was gone. The words hung in the air, heavy and unadorned. Clara could feel the grief in them, not fresh, but enduring, like a scar that would never fade completely. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The storm outside filled the silence, wrapping the room in its steady, cleansing rhythm. Finally, Clara stepped closer, her voice barely above a whisper. "You can't punish yourself forever. Ethan." He looked at her, as if unsure he'd heard right. She met his gaze steady, gentle, unafraid. "You made a mistake, a terrible one. But it doesn't mean your whole life has to be a sentence." Something flickered in his eyes then, a faint crack in the familiar coldness. "And what would you know about punishment?" he asked, not cruelly, but almost as a challenge. She smiled softly, enough to recognize it when I see it. "You've been serving yours for 17 years. He turned away, staring once more at the rain-streaked window. "It's not that simple." "I know," she said, "but maybe it doesn't have to be as hard as you've made it." The silence that followed was different this time, less guarded, more fragile, the kind that carries the first breath of release after too many years of holding it in. He finally sat down, his shoulders slumping as if the weight of memory had grown too heavy to carry, standing up. "Sometimes I think," he murmured, "that if I let go of the guilt, I'd lose the last piece of her I have left." Clara moved closer, stopping just a few feet away. "You don't honor her by hurting yourself," she said softly. "You honor her by living the kind of life she'd still want you to have." Her words seemed to settle into the room like the rain outside, quiet, persistent, impossible to ignore. Ethan didn't respond right away. But when he finally lifted his head, there was something new in his expression. Not peace, not yet, but the beginning of it, a small, fragile recognition that maybe forgiveness wasn't betrayal, it was survival. After a long moment, he said, "You should go home." "It's late." She nodded, gathering her things, but as she reached the door, she heard his voice again, softer this time. "Thank you." Clara paused, looking back at him. He was still seated, still staring out at the rain, but his posture had changed, less rigid, less armored. She smiled faintly. "You're welcome." When she stepped into the hallway, the storm was still raging outside. Yet, somehow, inside Mercer Tower, it felt a little quieter, and for the first time since she'd met him, Clara had the sense that Ethan Mercer wasn't just surviving his past anymore. He was beginning, very slowly, to let it go. Because sometimes, healing doesn't begin when the rain stops. It begins when we finally stop running from the storm within. The morning after the storm, the world seemed quieter. Chicago's skyline glistened under the pale light of dawn, and the city streets shimmered with puddles, reflecting the soft blush of sunrise. Inside Mercer Tower, the air felt different, lighter, somehow, as if the storm had carried something away with it. Clara arrived early, as she often did. When she passed Ethan's office, she found the door slightly ajar. He was there, standing by the window, coffee in hand, watching the mist rise from the lake. His posture was still composed, but there was a gentleness now in the way he looked at the world, like a man remembering what calm felt like. He didn't turn when she greeted him. He simply said, "Good morning, Clara." And for the first time, her name sounded less like a formality and more like something human, spoken with quiet familiarity. Their days settled into a new rhythm. He still wore his gloves, still guarded his space. But the silence between them no longer felt heavy. It was thoughtful, companionable, even comforting. It was during one of those calm mornings that Maggie appeared in the doorway, a folder clutched in her hand and a knowing look in her eyes. "Ethan," she said, "the board has confirmed your attendance for the Hearts of Stone Gala next Friday." They're expecting you? He looked up from his laptop, frowning. The gala, that annual circus I haven't attended in years. I know, Maggie said, her voice firm but gentle. But this year, the event benefits the Bridge Restoration Fund. The board believes your presence would send the right message. He set his coffee down, his expression unreadable. You mean they want to parade me in front of cameras? The fallen architect returned from ruin. Redemption. Packaged for press. Maggie didn't deny it. Maybe so. But this could also be a chance for people to see you differently. To see you again. Ethan leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a moment. You know I don't do well in those rooms. Maggie smiled faintly. Then don't go alone. His brow furrowed. Excuse me, you need a guest, she said simply. A partner. Someone who makes the room feel less like a battlefield. Someone who reminds you how to be seen without armor. Ethan's eyes flicked toward the glass wall, separating his office from the rest of the floor. Through it, he could see Clara at her desk, reviewing documents, her expression focused and calm. Maggie followed his gaze and smiled. She makes people trust you again, she said softly. That's not something you can fake. Ethan, he looked away quickly. She's my secretary. She's also the only person in this building who's ever made you smile. Maggie replied, with the blunt tenderness only an old friend could manage. Ethan said nothing. His fingers drummed lightly on the desk. A habit Clara had learned meant he was thinking measuring risk and emotion as if they were part of the same equation. Later that day, as the sun slipped behind the skyline, Ethan stood in his office again, watching the reflection of the city lights ripple across the glass. The idea of the gala lingered like a stone in his chest. It wasn't vanity that kept him from such events, it was fear. Fear of eyes on him. Whispers behind polite smiles. Fear of hands reaching for him. Even in kindness, he imagined stepping into a crowded ballroom, the noise, the proximity, the questions about the past he had spent years trying to bury. And beside that vision came another Clara, calm and steady, her presence softening the noise around him. He remembered her words from that night of the storm. You can't punish yourself forever. The next morning, he called Maggie into his office. She entered, arching an eyebrow as if already knowing his decision. I'll attend the gala, Ethan said finally. Maggie's eyes softened. And your guest? He hesitated, his gaze drifting toward the open door, where Clara's quiet voice could be heard on the phone. Arranging a meeting. I'll bring Miss Whitmore, he said at last. It's just business? Maggie smiled, though she didn't believe him for a moment. Of course. Ethan, just business? When she left, Ethan turned back to his desk, but focus eluded him. He wasn't sure what unsettled him more, the thought of returning to that glittering world of masks and champagne, or the idea of standing beside someone who might actually see through his. That evening, as Clara was gathering her things to leave, he stepped out of his office. Clara, he said, his tone measured but uncertain. She looked up, surprised to see him lingering after hours. Yes, Mr. Mercer. He cleared his throat, as if the words themselves were heavy. Next Friday, there's a charity event, the Hearts of Stone Gala. The board expects me to attend. She nodded slowly, unsure where the conversation was going. They also expect me, he continued, to bring a guest. Clara blinked, caught between confusion and curiosity. A guest. He shifted slightly, his eyes steady but guarded. I thought perhaps you might accompany me. For professional reasons, of course. It's a networking opportunity. Her lips curved in the faintest smile. Of course, she said gently. Just business? Ethan looked at her for a moment longer than necessary, as if trying to gauge what she truly thought. But Clara's expression was calm, kind, and without judgment, exactly what had unnerved and comforted him in equal measure since the day they met. When she left that night, Ethan remained in his office, staring out at the city that had both made and broken him. He could already imagine the flashing lights, the polished floors, the crowd pressing too close. His chest tightened at the thought, but beneath that fear, a quieter emotion stirred something almost like anticipation. Maybe it was because, for the first time in years, he wouldn't be walking into that room alone. He turned off the lights and stood for a long while, watching the last glow of the city fade into the horizon. "It's just business," he had said, but even he knew that wasn't entirely true. Because sometimes, life doesn't give us grand beginnings. It gives us second chances disguised as ordinary invitations, small, unexpected doors that open toward healing, if only we're brave enough to walk through them. The week leading up to the gala unfolded with quiet anticipation. Ethan buried himself in work, as though the endless meetings and reports could drown out the unease creeping into his chest. He told himself it was just another public appearance, another obligation to be endured, but deep down, he knew this time was different. Clara, for her part, approached it with gentle practicality. She didn't pry or fuss. She arranged his itinerary, confirmed their attendance, and even double-checked the seating chart to spare him unnecessary encounters. She seemed to sense his discomfort without needing to ask. That, he realized, was one of the many things that set her apart. The night arrived cold and crisp, the kind of Chicago evening where the air shimmered with frost and the city's lights looked like scattered stars. The Hearts of Stone Gala was held at the Art Institute, a place of marble halls, grand staircases, and echoes of 1,000 quiet conversations. Outside, a line of sleek cars idled beneath the portico, their engines purring softly in the night. Ethan stepped out of his car first, the cameras flashing like lightning against the dark. His tailored black suit fit perfectly, but the perfection felt like armor. The crowd of photographers called his name, though he barely acknowledged them. He had learned long ago that some eyes didn't seek to understand, they sought to consume. Then, from the opposite side of the car, Clara emerged. For a brief, wordless moment, the noise of the night faded. Her gown shimmered under the lights, a soft silver that caught the reflections of passing headlights. The fabric moved like liquid when she walked. Her hair swept into a simple, elegant style that framed her face. There was nothing ostentatious about her, no diamonds, no dramatic entrance yet somehow. She outshone everything around her. Ethan, who had built bridges and skyscrapers, who had seen beauty in steel and glass, found himself quietly breathless. "You look," he began, then stopped himself. Compliments were not his language. Clara smiled gently, reading the rest of the sentence in his eyes. "Thank you, Mr. Mercer." He offered his arm awkwardly at first, as though rediscovering a gesture he hadn't used in years. She hesitated for just a second, remembering the rule Maggie had once whispered to her. He doesn't like to be touched. But then, almost imperceptibly, he nodded. She placed her hand lightly on his arm, and together they entered the hall. Inside, the world was a swirl of sound and color. Jazz music floated from the live band near the staircase, mingling with the clinking of champagne glasses and the low murmur of conversation. The chandeliers sparkled like captured starlight. Everywhere they turned, faces followed them, some curious, some skeptical, some openly surprised. Ethan Mercer, the reclusive billionaire, attending a gala for the first time in over a decade, and not alone. Clara kept close but composed, her steps perfectly matched to his. She greeted the board members with grace, accepted introductions with poise, and carried herself not like someone out of place, but like someone who belonged through sheer quiet dignity. For a while, Ethan allowed himself to forget his discomfort. Their movements found an easy rhythm, she speaking softly when words were required, he offering quiet nods that seemed to carry weight. Together, they were steady, like two notes in a well-tuned harmony. But not everyone in that room was kind. Near the entrance to the main gallery, Sabrina Lowe, the company's public relations director, watched them with the polished smile of someone who'd learned to wield charm like a blade. She had once been close to Ethan, at least professionally. The distance between them now was no secret. "Well, isn't this something?" Sabrina said as she approached, her voice sweet as champagne and twice as sharp. Ethan Mercer at a gala. And with company, no less. Ethan's jaw tightened. Sabrina. Her eyes flicked toward Clara, scanning her in that subtle, cutting way only the practiced can manage. "You must be the new secretary." Clara, right from Ohio. Was it quite the leap from small-town Midwest to Mercer Tower? Clara met her gaze calmly, the same way she might steady a frightened animal. "Yes, it's been an honor to work here." Sabrina's smile widened. "I'm sure it has." Before Ethan could speak, Clara added, her tone even but firm. "It's amazing what people can do when someone believes in them." For the first time that evening, Ethan felt the faintest spark of pride, not the kind tied to wealth or success, but something far rarer: admiration. Sabrina's smile faltered for half a heartbeat before she recovered. "Of course," she said coolly. "Well, enjoy the evening. I'm sure everyone will be talking about it." When she walked away, Ethan exhaled, almost laughing under his breath. "You handled that better than I did?" Clara smiled softly. "I've learned that sometimes silence isn't weakness, it's control." He looked at her then, really looked, and realized how effortlessly she steadied him. Around her, the noise of the world didn't seem as loud. As the night unfolded, they made their way through the crowd past donors, journalists, executives. Ethan spoke when needed, but it was Clara's presence that anchored him, keeping his fears from clawing their way to the surface. Later, when the speeches began, the lights dimmed and the music softened into a slow, melodic jazz. Ethan stood by the tall windows overlooking Michigan Avenue, the glow of the city reflected in the glass. Clara joined him quietly, a glass of water in her hand instead of wine. "It's beautiful," she murmured, watching the reflection of the city lights. "It is," he said. Then, after a pause, "But sometimes I forget how to see it." She turned to him, her expression gentle. "Then, maybe tonight's a good reminder." For a long moment, neither spoke. The jazz swelled softly in the distance. The crowd murmured behind them, and the world outside stretched endless and luminous. Ethan's gaze lingered on Clara, not just her beauty, but the calm steadiness she carried within her, the quiet strength that had begun to thaw the cold corners of his life. He didn't reach for her hand, but the distance between them felt smaller than it had ever been. Somewhere deep inside, the man who had spent years hiding behind walls of glass felt something stir, a warmth unfamiliar, frightening, but undeniable. As they stood there, framed by the glittering city, Clara smiled faintly and said, "You're doing fine." And this time, Ethan didn't look away. Because sometimes, the most extraordinary nights are not the ones filled with applause or light, but the ones that make you remember what it means to feel again. The gala carried on long after the speeches ended, each moment gilded by the soft hum of jazz and the low clinking of glasses. The crowd had loosened. Laughter now floated easily between the marble columns, and the scent of lilies and champagne lingered in the air. Ethan had managed the evening better than he had expected. He hadn't withdrawn, hadn't panicked. With Clara by his side, the noise seemed bearable, even human. There were still moments when the room felt too small, too loud, but then she would look his way. And it was as if the air found its rhythm again. When the last of the formalities faded and conversation became the music of the room, Ethan allowed himself to relax just slightly. The weight of years spent avoiding crowds, of holding his breath in public spaces, began to ease. It wasn't comfort, not yet, but it was something like peace. Clara noticed the change in him. The tension around his shoulders had softened, his gaze less guarded. She stayed near, but didn't hover, giving him space to exist on his own terms. And then, like a chill that creeps in unnoticed, Sabrina appeared again, She had been watching them most of the evening, her smile sharp, her presence magnetic in that way only people accustomed to control could manage. As she approached, the shimmer of her dress caught the light, but her eyes, cold and calculating, never left Ethan. "Ethan," she purred, stepping close. "It's been too long. I was starting to think you'd vanished from the civilized world." He offered a polite nod. "Sabrina." Clara could sense the tension before it showed on his face. She'd learned to read the subtle signs, the slight tightening of his jaw, the way his fingers brushed against the cuff of his glove. Sabrina, ignoring Clara completely, took another step forward. "You remember how these events used to be," she said, her voice half teasing, half accusing. "You and I always managed to draw a crowd." Her laugh was light, rehearsed. Then she reached out a simple gesture, almost innocent, and laid her hand on his forearm. The reaction was instant. Ethan froze, his breath catching as if he'd been struck. The muscles in his shoulders went rigid, his gloved hand trembling ever so slightly. His eyes widened, not in anger, but in pure, instinctive panic. The noise around them seemed to dull into nothing. The band, the chatter, the laughter all fading beneath the sound of his heartbeat roaring in his ears. Clara saw it all in an instant, the fear, the memory, the years of restraint breaking through the surface. She didn't think, she simply moved. Stepping between them, she gently but firmly removed Sabrina's hand from his arm. "Excuse us," she said, her tone calm yet unyielding. "We have another appointment." Sabrina blinked, stunned into silence. There was no aggression in Clara's voice, but there was power, the kind that doesn't need to be loud to be felt. Before Ethan could protest, Clara took his hand. It was instinct, again an act of protection, not thought. Her fingers slid into his, warm against the cool leather of his glove. For a heartbeat, he almost pulled away, but something in her touch steady, grounded, without judgment kept him there. The world steadied, his breath, which had been sharp and uneven, began to slow. The tremor in his hand eased, his shoulders lowered. The panic that had been seconds from consuming him receded like a tide. Clara guided him gently away from the crowd, down the side corridor of the gallery, where the music softened and the air grew still. They stopped near a sculpture bathed in pale light, the hum of voices now distant. She didn't speak right away. She just held his gaze, waiting. He looked down at their hands, hers small and sure. His gloved fingers still wrapped around hers, and exhaled, long and heavy. "I'm sorry," he murmured, voice low. "I didn't mean to." "You don't have to apologize," she said softly. "Not for that." He shook his head, as if ashamed of the moment. "I thought I was past it, but when she touched me—" "You're human," Clara interrupted gently. "And being human isn't something to be sorry for." Ethan met her eyes then, truly met them, and what he saw there was not pity, but understanding something far rarer and infinitely kinder. They stood there in silence, surrounded by marble and art and the faint echo of music. Outside, the storm of the gala continued, but here, in this small pocket of calm, something shifted quietly between them. Finally, he spoke again, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You made me feel safe." Clara's lips curved in a faint, almost wistful smile. "Then I did my job." He wanted to tell her that it wasn't her job, not in any way that mattered, but the words caught in his throat. Instead, he simply nodded, holding on to the truth of what she'd given him in that moment. Safety. Grace. When they returned to the ballroom, the world hadn't changed, but he had. He carried himself differently now, no longer hiding behind the rigid posture of control. His gaze was softer, his movements slower, deliberate. Sabrina saw them pass and turned away, her expression unreadable. The whispers that followed didn't matter. What mattered was that Ethan Mercer, for the first time in 17 years, had been touched and hadn't flinched away from it. Later that night, when the last of the guests had gone and the echoes of music lingered faintly in the marble halls. Ethan escorted Clara to the car waiting outside. The air had cooled, carrying the faint scent of rain. He opened the door for her, then paused, his hand resting on the frame. "Clara," he said quietly, "about tonight." She looked up, waiting. He hesitated, the words fragile in his mouth. "You made me feel safe," he repeated, as though saying it aloud made it more real. Clara smiled, her breath visible in the chill night air. "Then maybe that's where healing starts." He watched her step into the car, the silver of her dress catching the reflection of the city lights, and something within him softened something that had been frozen for far too long. As the car pulled away, Ethan stood there a moment longer, the night air brushing against his face. For the first time in years, the distance between himself and the world didn't feel quite so insurmountable. Because sometimes, the smallest acts of courage aren't found in the grand gestures of success, but in the quiet touch of another person who reminds us that safety, after all, can still be found in kindness. In the days following the gala, the atmosphere at Mercer Tower seemed subtly altered. The whispers in the hallways had softened, replaced by a quiet sense of curiosity. People had seen Ethan Mercer differently that night, not as the distant, untouchable man behind the glass walls, but as someone almost human again. Yet while the world outside celebrated his return to the public eye, the cost of that evening had settled silently inside him. At first, Clara didn't notice the change. Ethan worked as he always did, arriving before dawn, leaving long after the last light had faded from the city skyline. But there was something new in the way he carried himself, a deep weariness that seemed to hum beneath his skin. His movements were slower, his focus scattered. Some days, she'd catch him staring out the window, not lost in thought, but emptied by it. She wanted to ask if he was all right, but Ethan Mercer was not a man who admitted to frailty. His life had been built on control over time, over chaos, over himself. And control, once cracked, can only be held together for so long. The first real sign came on a Monday morning. Clara arrived early to find his office light already on. It was just past 6, the city still half asleep. She stepped inside quietly, carrying the folder of reports he'd requested the night before. At first, everything seemed normal, the desk piled with papers, the faint aroma of cold coffee, his jacket draped neatly over the chair. But then she saw him. Ethan was seated on the floor beside his desk, one hand pressed to his temple, the other limp at his side. His face was pale, his breath shallow. The sight froze her in place for a second before instinct took over. "Mr. Mercer," she whispered, rushing to his side. He didn't respond. She knelt, her heart pounding. "Ethan, can you hear me?" A faint sound escaped him, a groan, weak and disoriented. "I'm fine," he murmured, but the words dissolved before they could mean anything. Clara's hands shook as she pulled out her phone, dialing emergency services. Her voice was calm when she spoke to the dispatcher, though inside she felt her chest tightening, her throat burning with fear. Within minutes, the sound of sirens echoed faintly from below. She stayed with him, kneeling on the cold marble floor, whispering his name to keep him awake. His breathing was uneven, his face slick with sweat. "Help's on the way," she said softly. "You're not alone. Do you hear me?" When the paramedics arrived, she guided them through the building, her voice steady, but her hands trembling. They lifted Ethan carefully onto a stretcher, the monitor beeping faintly as they checked his vitals. Clara followed them down the elevator, her heart hammering in rhythm with the distant thud of her pulse. She climbed into the ambulance without asking permission. No one questioned her. The ride to the hospital blurred into fragments the flashing red lights, the sterile scent of antiseptic, the low murmur of the medic giving numbers she couldn't fully understand. She sat beside Ethan, gripping his hand gently through the thin fabric of his glove. "Just breathe," she whispered. "You've carried too much for too long." He didn't answer, but the faint pressure of his fingers around hers told her he was still there, still fighting to stay tethered. When they arrived, the hospital was already awake, the hum of machinery, the shuffle of nurses, the soft echo of voices calling names down sterile corridors. The fluorescent lights were harsh, casting everything in sharp contrast. They wheeled him into a private room. Clara stood outside the glass door as doctors moved around him, their words clipped and efficient. Exhaustion, dehydration, cardiac stress, phrases she barely processed, only understanding the gravity in their tone. When they finally left, she stepped quietly inside. Ethan lay still beneath a thin blanket, his face turned toward the window where the gray light of morning filtered through the blinds. The steady rhythm of the heart monitor filled the silence steady, fragile, alive. Clara sat beside him, her own reflection faintly visible in the glass behind him. She thought of the countless hours he'd spent in that office, building, calculating, striving, pushing his body and mind beyond what either was meant to bear. And she thought of how loneliness, when carried long enough, can be heavier than any workload. Reaching out, she took his hand again. The gloves had been removed by the nurses. His skin felt cool beneath hers. She didn't speak. There were no words that could fill this kind of quiet. Instead, she let the silence settle, soft and reverent, the way one might sit beside an old wound that had finally stopped bleeding. Hours passed. Nurses came and went, adjusting machines, murmuring updates. Maggie arrived, her eyes wide with worry. But when she saw Clara sitting there, she only nodded in quiet understanding. "He needs rest," Maggie whispered. "Years of strain will catch up, no matter how strong you think you are." Clara nodded, her gaze never leaving him. He's always been strong, just not in the way he needs to be. When Ethan finally stirred, it was near evening. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. The light had softened, the room dim. Clara leaned forward, her hand still in his. "You're at the hospital," she said gently. "You collapsed this morning." He blinked, disoriented. "I remember the office." And then, "You don't have to explain," she said. "Just rest." His gaze fell to their joined hands, his brow furrowing as if the sight startled him. But he didn't pull away. Instead, his fingers tightened slightly, weak but deliberate. "Clara," he murmured, voice hoarse. "You shouldn't have stayed." She smiled faintly. "Where else would I be?" He closed his eyes again, the faintest trace of a smile ghosting across his lips, a fragile, human thing that reached her heart like sunlight through glass. Outside, the evening sky began to darken, and the rain returned, soft against the hospital windows. And as Clara sat there, still holding his hand, she realized something sometimes. Breaking isn't failure. It's the body's way of asking to be cared for, the soul's way of begging for rest. Ethan Mercer had spent years refusing to be touched, but tonight, in this quiet room under the hum of hospital lights, he allowed it, and perhaps that was the truest measure of healing yet. Because even the strongest structures must sometimes fall, not to be destroyed, but to be rebuilt with gentler hands. Night settled softly over the city, its quiet broken only by the steady hum of hospital machinery and the rhythm of Ethan Mercer's heartbeat pulsing through the monitor. Clara had not left his side. The nurses had offered her a chair, then a blanket, and finally gave up suggesting rest when they realized she wouldn't go home. She stayed through the long, sleepless hours, through the sterile light, through the whispers of doctors checking vitals, through the gentle rise and fall of Ethan's breathing. Somewhere between midnight and dawn, exhaustion pulled her under. She fell asleep in the chair beside him, her head resting lightly against the edge of the bed, her hand still holding his. Outside, the rain had stopped. The world was still, suspended in that tender space between night and morning, when everything feels fragile and new. When Ethan woke, he didn't know where he was. The light above him was soft and colorless, and for a moment, panic flickered through his chest, a familiar rush of confusion and dread. But then he turned his head and saw her. Clara, asleep, her hair slightly undone, her breathing slow and steady, her hand still in his. Something inside him shifted, not abruptly, but gently, like the sound of ice cracking under the first warmth of spring. He lay there for a long while, just watching her. The quiet between them filled with the soft beeping of the monitor and the faint hum of the world outside the window. He couldn't remember the last time he'd woken up and felt safe, not powerful, not in control, just safe. When Clara stirred, her eyes fluttering open, she blinked a few times before realizing he was awake. She straightened quickly, rubbing her eyes, embarrassed by the moment of vulnerability. "You're awake," she said softly, her voice hoarse from sleep. He managed a faint smile. "You stayed." Her lips curved into a sleepy grin. "Where else could I be?" There was no hesitation in her voice, no apology. Just quiet certainty, the kind that made his chest tighten. Ethan looked away, his gaze finding the pale morning light creeping through the blinds. "You didn't have to," he murmured. "I know," she said simply. That's why it mattered. The silence that followed was gentle, not awkward, the kind of silence that holds meaning rather than emptiness. He turned his hand slightly, his fingers brushing against hers. The gesture was small but deliberate. "You shouldn't have seen me like that," he said after a moment. "Falling apart." "You weren't falling apart," she replied. "You were finally letting go." Her words landed softly, but they struck something deep inside him. He had spent so long gripping every fragment of control, believing that strength meant never breaking. But sitting here, under the dull hospital light, he realized that Clara saw strength differently, not as endurance, but as honesty. He took a slow breath, gathering courage from the quiet. "There's something I need to tell you," he said. She looked at him, waiting. "For years," he began, his voice trembling at the edges. "I thought I was cursed. Everyone I let close to me. I lost my fiancé, my trust, my peace. It was easier to believe I was poison than to hope again." Clara's eyes softened. She didn't interrupt. She didn't fill the silence. She simply let him speak the first time. Perhaps anyone had ever truly listened. "When I stopped letting people touch me," he continued, "it wasn't pride, it was fear. Every hand felt like a reminder of what I'd destroyed. I told myself it was better this way, safe, distant, controlled. But lately," his voice caught slightly, and he turned his face toward her. "When you touch me, I don't feel panic. I don't feel guilt. I feel peace, like I can breathe again." The words hung in the space between them, raw, unguarded, beautiful. Clara's throat tightened, not from surprise, but from the ache of knowing what it meant for him to say it aloud. She leaned closer, her voice quiet but firm. "Then, let's stop running." He blinked, searching her eyes. "Running from everything," she said. "From the past, from people, from yourself. You've spent 17 years punishing yourself for surviving. Maybe it's time to start living again." Her words weren't a command, they were an offering. And in her tone, there was no pity, only truth. Ethan looked down at their joined hands, his bare skin against hers. He could feel the warmth of her touch radiating upward, soft and steady. The tremor that used to come whenever someone reached for him was gone. In its place was something unfamiliar but deeply grounding trust. He closed his fingers around hers, the smallest smile flickering at the corner of his mouth. "You make it sound easy." She smiled back. "Not easy? Just worth it?" Outside, the first light of morning stretched across the horizon, painting the hospital walls with a faint golden glow. The city was waking, but in that quiet room, time seemed to pause. Ethan lay back against the pillow, his hand still in hers. "You know," he said softly, "I've spent years building things meant to last: bridges, towers, walls, but I never built anything that made me feel whole." Clara's voice was a whisper. "Maybe wholeness isn't built. Maybe it's found piece by piece, when you finally stop hiding." He looked at her for a long moment, something unspoken passing between them, gratitude, understanding, and the first fragile spark of something even deeper. The monitor beside him beeped softly, steady as a heartbeat. In that moment, Ethan realized that healing didn't come like thunder or flame. It came quietly through kindness, through connection, through the steady presence of someone who refused to walk away. He turned his head toward her once more. "Thank you," he said simply. Clara smiled, her eyes warm and bright in the morning light. "Just promise me one thing," she whispered. "When you get out of here, don't go back to hiding behind glass." He nodded slowly. No more glass. And, in that room, filled with quiet light and the rhythm of life returning, something between them began to bloom soft, certain, and beautifully human. Because sometimes, love doesn't arrive with grand declarations. It arrives in a whisper, a touch, a promise to stay, and in that promise, even the most wounded hearts remember how to beat again. The days after Ethan's release from the hospital were a quiet kind of beautiful. The world, once sharp and demanding, seemed to soften around him. He returned to Mercer Tower slowly, just a few hours each day at first, while Clara worked nearby. Careful not to hover, but always close enough if he needed her. Something between them had changed. It wasn't spoken aloud, but it lived in the small things, in the way Ethan paused before thanking her, in the way Clara smiled when he looked her way, in the quiet ease that filled the spaces where silence used to sting. For the first time in years, his office didn't feel like a cage. It felt, somehow, like a beginning. But beginnings, as Ethan had learned, rarely arrive without their shadows. It started with whispers, an article here, a rumor there. At first, neither of them noticed. The world outside Mercer Tower had always been noisy, full of speculation and envy. But then one morning, Maggie entered his office, her face drawn, a folded newspaper trembling in her hand. "You need to see this," she said quietly. Ethan took the paper. His eyes fell on the headline before he could stop himself. Mercer's secretary love or leverage beneath it. A photo Clara beside him at the gala, her hand resting lightly on his arm, both of them half lit by the chandeliers. The caption read, "From small town Ohio to Mercer Tower, has Ethan Mercer's latest protege found more than a paycheck?" The article was vicious in its precision. It spoke of Clara's family debts, her modest background, her sudden rise within Mercer Industries. It quoted anonymous sources suggesting favoritism, manipulation, and whispered that the once reclusive billionaire had succumbed to the charms of a convenient Cinderella. Ethan's stomach twisted as he read, not because of the words he had been slandered before, but because of the name attached to the leak. Sabrina Lowe. He folded the paper slowly, the sound of crumpling newsprint breaking the silence. Maggie watched him, her expression pained. "She's been waiting for this moment," she said softly. "To make you doubt yourself again." To make her, she nodded toward the door, where Clara's office lay just beyond, seemed like everyone else who's ever let you down. Clara didn't need to read the article to feel its weight. By noon, her phone was full of unread messages, some cruel, some merely curious, all invasive. Cameras appeared outside the building. Online, her name was being twisted into something she barely recognized. She stood by her desk, pale but composed. When Ethan stepped out of his office, for a moment, neither spoke. "I didn't know about this," she began quietly. "About the debts. They're my father's, not mine. I've been paying them off for years." "I know," he said. His voice was calm, but there was a storm beneath it. Her eyes searched his face, looking for something, assurance, perhaps, or forgiveness. "This is going to hurt your reputation. The board, I don't care about the board. But you should," she said gently. "You've worked too hard for this company to fall because of me." He looked at her, then really looked and saw the pain she was trying to hide behind professionalism. The same steadiness that had comforted him now looked fragile. as though one more cruel word might break it. "Clara," he said, his voice low. "You did nothing wrong. I did something foolish," she replied softly. "I let people see me beside you. I should have known what they'd say." He wanted to tell her that it didn't matter, that what they had was real, even if it had no name yet. But the old fear crept in, the fear that had shaped every wall he'd ever built. What if this, too, collapsed? What if caring for her meant watching her destroyed by proximity to him? By afternoon, the news had spread across every outlet. The Mercer scandal, they called it. Analysts debated it. Talk shows dissected it. Investors called for statements. The board demanded explanations. Clara saw the pressure tightening around him. The building that had once been a fortress now felt like a trap. That evening, she walked into his office one last time. The city glowed outside, the glass walls reflecting two figures who suddenly looked very far apart. "I think I should resign," she said quietly. Ethan's head snapped up. "No. It's the only way to calm this down." He rose from his chair, crossing the space between them. "You think walking away fixes this? That it erases what they've said? It protects you," she said, "and maybe that's enough." His hands clenched at his sides, his control fraying. "You think I need protection from you?" Tears welled in her eyes, though her voice remained steady. "I think you've carried enough blame for one lifetime. I don't want to be the reason you carry more." He wanted to reach for her, to stop her from leaving, but the words wouldn't come. Years of fear and guilt had trained him to freeze when the heart spoke louder than reason. So, he said nothing. She gave a small, broken smile. "I'll send my resignation in the morning." And then she was gone, quiet footsteps down the marble hallway, the sound fading like the end of a song. Ethan stood there long after, the city's reflection burning faintly on the glass. Every instinct told him to chase her, to undo the silence between them. But his old enemy, the fear of losing what he dared to love, held him still. When Maggie entered later that night, she found him staring at the skyline, the newspaper still on his desk. "You're doing it again," she said softly. He didn't look at her. "Doing what? Letting fear make your choices." He closed his eyes. "If I fight this, it'll destroy her. And if you don't," Maggie's voice trembled with quiet conviction, "then you'll destroy yourself. You know better than anyone what silence costs." Her words cut deep because they were true. Ethan turned toward the window, his reflection ghost-like against the city lights. "I don't know how to fix this." "Yes, you do," Maggie said. "You just have to decide whether you're brave enough this time." When she left, the office fell into silence again. But something had changed. For years, Ethan Mercer had built his life around control, around the belief that walls kept pain away. Yet tonight, staring into the dark reflection of his own face, he realized what Clara had taught him. Walls don't save us. They only keep love from finding a way in. And for the first time in a long, long while, Ethan felt something stronger than fear resolve. Because some things are worth breaking for. That night, Ethan didn't go home. He sat alone in his office long after the lights of Chicago faded into a blue haze. The city outside gleamed with indifference. But inside Mercer Tower, he felt the sharp ache of his own silence pressing in. Clara's absence hung heavy in the air. Her desk sat empty, the faint scent of her coffee still lingering. On it lay a single envelope, her resignation letter, sealed but unread. He couldn't bring himself to open it. Maggie's words echoed in his mind. "Don't let fear decide for you again." He thought of all the years he'd spent hiding behind walls of discipline, of how each choice made in fear had only built another layer of loneliness around him. And now, because he'd chosen silence again, he'd lost the only person who had ever seen him clearly. By dawn, something inside him broke not in despair, but in clarity. He was done letting fear write his story. When the sun rose, Mercer Tower stirred awake to chaos. Reporters filled the lobby. Board members had called an emergency meeting. Sabrina Lowe was already there, her polished heels echoing on the marble floor, her expression calm and confident as if she'd already won. The conference room was packed. Cameras from the press lined the back wall. The company's executives sat stiffly around the long glass table, whispering in low, uneasy tones. Ethan entered last, his presence cutting through the room like a sudden change in weather. He didn't sit. He didn't need to. Before we begin, Sabrina started smoothly. I'd just like to express how unfortunate this situation has become. The company's reputation has suffered, and I think we all agree that decisive action must be taken. Ethan's gaze met hers, steady and unflinching. Decisive action, he repeated quietly. That's exactly what I intend to take. A murmur rippled through the room. Sabrina straightened, her smile tightening. Then, perhaps we're on the same page. No, Ethan said. I doubt we are. He walked to the center of the room, resting his hands on the edge of the table. I've spent most of my life trying to control the narrative around me. I believed silence was strength, but silence in the face of injustice isn't strength, it's complicity. The board shifted uncomfortably, cameras clicked. Sabrina's expression flickered, but she kept her composure. Ethan continued, his tone calm but resonant. Over the last week, this company has allowed a lie to spread a lie about an employee who did nothing but her job with integrity and grace. A lie started not by the public, but by one of our own. He turned to Sabrina. By you, gasps filled the room. Sabrina laughed softly, a rehearsed sound. Ethan, I understand you're under pressure, but you can't possibly. He cut her off with quiet authority. I can, and I do. From his jacket pocket, he pulled out a printed email evidence Maggie had uncovered that morning. He laid it on the table. The words visible for all to see, leaked correspondence between Sabrina and a journalist. Trading gossip for exposure. Her confidence faltered. This is absurd, she said sharply. You think protecting that girl is worth risking your company's credibility. Ethan's eyes didn't waver. No, he said softly. I'm protecting something far more valuable, its integrity. The room fell into silence. He stood straighter, his voice growing stronger with each word. This company was built on the idea that merit matters more than background, that what you build with your hands and your heart defines you, not where you come from, not what people whisper about you. He turned toward the cameras now, knowing his words would reach far beyond these walls. We live in a world too quick to measure worth by pedigree instead of principle. But I've learned sometimes painfully that real strength has nothing to do with wealth or lineage. It has to do with character, with kindness, with courage. He paused, his gaze distant for a moment, as though seeing Clara in his mind's eye. Clara Whitmore is one of the most capable, compassionate people I've ever known. I knew about her family's struggles from the day she was hired, and I chose her anyway, not in spite of them, but because of them. Because she knows what it means to fight for what's right when the world underestimates you. A hush fell over the room. Some of the executives exchanged glances, others simply stared. Even the cameras stopped clicking for a moment. The stillness charged with something raw and real. Ethan took a breath, steadying his voice. If any of you believe that makes me weak, or that compassion is a liability, then perhaps you're in the wrong company. His words landed like a quiet thunderclap. Sabrina's face had gone pale. You'll regret this, she whispered. No, Ethan said. For once. I won't. He turned toward the board. Ms. Lowe's contract is terminated effective immediately. Mercer Industries does not and will not stand for deceit or cruelty disguised as professionalism. He walked out of the room to a flurry of murmurs, flashes, and the click of doors opening behind him, but the noise barely reached him. For the first time in years, he wasn't running from his reflection. Outside the building, the morning air was sharp and clear. Reporters swarmed the steps, shouting questions, cameras flashing. Ethan paused, looking out over the sea of lenses and faces. You all came here for a story, he said calmly. So, here it is. There's no scandal, no secret, just a woman who did her job, and a company that forgot what integrity looks like. I intend to remind them. With that, he turned and walked back inside. The crowd erupted behind him, but he didn't look back. When he reached his office, Maggie was waiting. She smiled softly, her eyes warm with quiet pride. "Well," she said, "you finally spoke." Ethan sank into his chair, exhaustion mingling with relief. "I should have done it sooner." Maggie placed a hand on his shoulder. "You did it when it mattered most." For a long while, he sat in silence, gazing at the skyline beyond the glass. It looked different now, not like a fortress, but like an open horizon. He reached for the phone on his desk, dialing a familiar number. When Clara's voice answered, soft and cautious on the other end, he said, "Just one thing. You don't have to resign, not anymore." There was a pause, long, breathless, hopeful. Then her voice, steady and warm. "I wasn't going to." And in that single moment, something inside him finally stilled. Because redemption, he realized, wasn't found in silence or strength. It was found in the courage to stand beside the truth, no matter how much noise surrounded it. In the days following the confrontation, the air inside Mercer Tower changed. It was subtle at first, a kind of stillness, a quiet cleansing that replaced the noise of gossip and fear. The storm had passed, and in its wake, something lighter began to take root. The board issued statements. The press moved on. Sabrina's name faded from the headlines, and so did the scandal. What remained, instead, was the story of a man who stood up not for power, but for truth, for dignity, for love. Clara returned to work a week later. When she stepped into the building, the same marble floors that had once felt cold now gleamed under the soft morning light. The whispers had stopped. The air itself seemed to breathe easier. Maggie met her in the lobby, smiling the kind of smile that speaks without words. "He's waiting for you," she said quietly. Clara nodded, her heart steady but full. She found Ethan in his office, standing by the window. The afternoon sun poured in behind him, painting his figure in gold. He turned when she entered, and for a long moment, they just looked at each other, no explanations, no apologies. Everything that needed to be said was already written in the silence between them. "You came back," he said at last, his voice soft. "I never really left," she replied. A smile ghosted across his face, something real and unguarded. "There's something I want to show you," he said. He led her to the rooftop, an expanse of open sky and glass railings, high above the noise of the city. From there, Chicago stretched endlessly, bathed in the colors of sunset. The lake shimmered like a mirror of gold, and the skyline glowed with 1,000 points of light. "This is where I come when I need to remember why I built all this," he said quietly. "It's strange, isn't it? How you can reach the top of the world and still feel like you're falling." Clara stood beside him, the wind brushing through her hair. "You're not falling anymore," she said gently. He looked at her, his expression thoughtful. "No," he murmured. "Not anymore." For a long while, they stood in silence. The city hummed below them, the faint rush of cars, the distant sound of sirens, the heartbeat of a place that never truly sleeps. The air was cool and clear, tinged with that bittersweet scent that only autumn evenings carry, the smell of endings and beginnings, folded into one. Then Ethan turned toward her, his hand slipping into his jacket pocket. When he spoke again, his voice trembled just slightly. "Clara," he said, "there's something I've been meaning to give you." She watched as he pulled out a small velvet box, worn, its corners softened by time. "It belonged to my mother," he said. "She wore it every day until the day she passed. My father gave it to her before he left for his first overseas project. She used to say it wasn't the gold or the diamond that mattered. It was the promise behind it." He opened the box. Inside lay a ring, simple, timeless, a single diamond catching the last light of the setting sun. Clara's breath caught. "Ethan, He took a step closer, his gaze steady. "You didn't melt me, Clara," he said softly. "Everyone always thought that's what it would take to melt the ice, to break the walls. But you didn't melt me. You taught me how to feel again." Her eyes glistened. "Ethan?" "You don't have to, I know," he interrupted gently. "That's why I want to. Because for the first time in my life, I'm not doing this out of guilt or fear. I'm doing it because I've finally learned what peace feels like, and it has your voice in it." The wind swept between them, carrying the faint sound of the city far below. He took her hand, the same hand that had once steadied his in an ambulance, the same hand that had held his through storms and silence, and slipped the ring gently onto her finger. "Marry me," he said, "not because it's expected, not because it's perfect, but because somehow, against every odd, we found our way to this moment, and I don't want to face another sunrise without knowing you'll be in it." Clara's tears fell softly, carried away by the wind. She looked at him, the man who had once lived behind glass, who now stood unguarded beneath an open sky, and she smiled. "Yes," she whispered, 1,000 times, "yes." He exhaled, the tension in his shoulders melting into quiet relief. For a moment, he simply looked at her, the woman who had brought warmth back into his frozen world. The city lights came alive around them as night descended. Reflections danced across the lake, painting streaks of silver and gold. Somewhere far below, traffic hummed and life went on. Unaware that high above, two people were rewriting their own history. Ethan pulled her close, not with hesitation this time, but with certainty. Their foreheads touched, their breaths mingling in the cool air. "You know," she said softly, "you once told me you didn't like being touched." He smiled faintly. "I didn't like being touched by the world," he said, "but you're not the world. Clara, you're home." The words settled between them like a prayer. When they finally looked out over the city again, the last light of the sun was fading, giving way to the quiet shimmer of twilight. And in that moment, Ethan Mercer, man of glass, man of silence, realized something simple and profound. The world had never been against him. It had just been waiting for him to open his hands. Below, the lake reflected the city's glow. Above, the stars began to pierce the sky one by one. And between those two infinities, a man who had once feared love stood with the woman who had taught him how to live it. Because sometimes, love doesn't rescue us from the cold, it teaches us how to build warmth of our own. 6 months passed, and Chicago bloomed into spring. The winter that once gripped the city, and Ethan Mercer's heart had melted away, replaced by the gentle rhythm of sunlight and renewal. The glass walls of Mercer Tower, which once reflected his isolation, now shimmered with life. People smiled when they passed him in the halls. He smiled back. Ethan had changed not in the way that draws headlines, but in the quiet ways that matter most. His voice had softened, his eyes, once sharp with vigilance, now carried warmth. He still worked with precision, still demanded excellence, but there was patience now in how he spoke, gratitude in how he listened. Clara saw it every day, not as a transformation, but as a return, the slow reemergence of the man he was always meant to be. And on a bright Saturday morning in May, under skies brushed with soft gold, that return found its completion. The wedding was small by choice, no flashing cameras, no grand cathedral, no spectacle, just a handful of people who had stood with them through the storms, Maggie, a few close friends, and the sound of the lake murmuring softly against the shore. They had chosen the lakeside, near a quiet clearing framed by willows, where the air carried the faint scent of blooming lilacs. A simple arch of white roses stood at the water's edge, its reflection rippling gently in the sunlit waves. Clara arrived in a dress of pale ivory, light as the breeze. Her hair was gathered loosely, a few strands dancing around her face. She looked radiant not because of the gown, but because peace had found her. She no longer carried the weight of being misunderstood, or the fear of stepping into someone else's world. She had built her own with him. Ethan stood waiting by the arch, wearing a dark suit and a smile that reached his eyes. When she stepped toward him, the world seemed to still. The only sounds were the soft rustle of leaves and the whisper of waves brushing the shore. When she reached him, he took her hand bare, ungloved, unafraid. The gesture, simple as it was, carried the history of every wall he had ever broken down to reach her. Maggie, standing nearby, smiled through tears as she began to speak. Her voice was clear, steady, and full of the kind of love that only time can deepen. Marriage, she said, isn't about two perfect people finding each other. It's about two imperfect souls choosing to walk forward hand in hand through all that life will bring. It's about grace, forgiveness, and courage. And sometimes, it's about remembering that warmth doesn't come from the sun. It comes from the people brave enough to love us. Clara's eyes glistened. Ethan's hand tightened gently around hers. When the vows were spoken, they didn't sound rehearsed or grand, they sounded real. Promises made, not in poetry, but in truth. I spent years, Ethan said softly, believing I was broken, but you showed me that pain isn't an ending, it's a door. And love is what waits on the other side. Clara smiled through her tears. And I spent years believing I wasn't enough. But you taught me that strength doesn't come from where we start. It comes from who we become when someone finally believes in us. Their words were carried by the wind, blending with the music of the lake and the laughter of the people who loved them. When Maggie pronounced them husband and wife, applause rose softly, more like a prayer than celebration. Ethan turned to Clara, brushed a strand of hair from her face, and kissed her. It wasn't a cinematic moment, it was tender, certain, deeply human. The kind of kiss that says, we made it through. Later, as twilight settled over the water, music drifted through the clearing. It wasn't planned, just a small band playing softly near the edge of the dock. Ethan hesitated when Clara tugged at his hand, inviting him to dance. He had never been one for dancing, not since before the bridge, before the fear. But when he looked into her eyes, he saw no expectation, only trust. So he took her hand, and together they stepped onto the wooden dock. The boards creaked gently under their feet as the music swayed around them. At first, they moved awkwardly, two people finding rhythm in uncertainty. But then his hand settled at her waist, hers rested against his chest, and something beautiful happened. They began to move as one. The moment was simple, but in its simplicity lay everything the years of distance. The breaking, the healing, the warmth that had returned. Maggie watched from the shore, her hands folded over her heart. Around her, laughter mingled with the soft music. Above, the first stars began to pierce the deepening sky. As they danced, Clara leaned close and whispered, "You're not afraid anymore?" Ethan smiled, the reflection of the moon glimmering in his eyes. "Not when I'm with you?" Her laughter was quiet, like the sound of a secret being kept between hearts. "Then don't ever let go." He didn't. The night deepened. The city lights across the water shimmered like distant constellations. The air was cool, and the last traces of winter seemed to fade completely. And as they swayed under the vast, forgiving sky, it felt as though the world itself exhaled a long, peaceful sigh after a season of storms. Somewhere behind them, Maggie's voice carried softly, as though speaking not just to them, but to the wind, the water, and to anyone who might one day listen. Sometimes, love doesn't arrive to fix us. It arrives to remind us that we were never broken, only waiting to be touched by kindness. The words lingered, wrapping around the night like a benediction. And as Ethan and Clara danced on, the lake mirrored their reflection, two figures moving gently in the fading light, their hands entwined, their hearts steady. The snow had melted, the cold had passed, and in its place, warmth had found its way home. At its heart, this story isn't just about love, it's about healing. It reminds us that strength isn't found in walls of control or years of silence, but in the courage to be open again. Ethan's journey shows how pain, no matter how deep, doesn't have to define us. What truly changes a life is kindness, the quiet kind that listens, forgives, and stays. We all carry scars the world cannot see. Some of us, like Ethan, learn to hide behind success, believing distance will protect us from being hurt again. But sooner or later, life brings someone or something that challenges that distance, a person who reminds us that connection, not perfection, is what makes us human. Clara's gentleness teaches us that compassion is never weakness. It's the bridge between broken hearts and new beginnings. So, if life has ever made you afraid to trust, to try, or to feel again, remember this: healing doesn't come when someone fixes you. It begins when someone truly sees you, and when you finally allow yourself to be seen. Because warmth doesn't find us by accident, it returns the moment we stop turning away from it. Thank you so much for spending your time with this story. If it touched your heart, even just a little, please take a moment to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps us keep creating stories that warm the soul and remind us of the beauty in second chances. Every view, every comment, every share means more than you know. It keeps this community of kindness growing. So, stay with us, because more heartfelt stories are waiting just around the corner. Together, let's keep shining a little more light into the world, one story at a time.